You wouldn't think a goat could start a war. But here we are. It was a peaceful Thursday morning on my small farmstead. The sun had just broken over the rooftops of Willow Creek Estates, glinting off the dew on my vegetable garden. My hens clucked softly in their coop. The bees buzzed happily in their hives, and Maisy, my favorite Nigerian dwarf goat, was busy trying to eat the corner of the "No Trespassing" sign I'd hung on my fence. She had a thing for irony. Life was simple, quiet, or at least it was until Karen Thompson, the newly elected HOA president, decided my animals were a blight on the community. That's a direct quote from the letter she duct-taped to my front gate, right where Maisy could get at it. I'd have laughed if I wasn't already grinding my teeth. Effective immediately, the letter declared. All livestock must be removed from the premises to maintain the aesthetic integrity of Willow Creek Estates. According to Karen, that included my goats, chickens, rabbits, and somehow my bees. She cited a brand new HOA bylaw, passed during one of her infamous emergency meetings, and gave me 48 hours to comply. Or else. What Karen didn't realize was that Maisy and the rest of my so-called livestock weren't just pets. They were the backbone of my business, the one that supplied nearly every cafe, farmer's market, and fine dining restaurant in the entire county, including the exclusive organic grocery where Karen bought her gluten-free, non-GMO, sustainably harvested almond milk. The moment Karen declared war on my animals, she unknowingly declared war on herself. And this quiet little farmer was about to remind her, and the entire HOA, that you don't bite the hand that feeds you, especially when I feed everyone. It started with a neon orange violation notice slapped right in the middle of my front door. I found it when I came back from my morning deliveries, arms full of fresh eggs and goat cheese. The paper was impossible to miss, practically glowing in the afternoon sun like it was proud of itself. I didn't even have to read it to know who was behind it. Karen Thompson, president of the Willow Creek Estates HOA, self-proclaimed defender of neighborhood property values, and, apparently, the mortal enemy of farm animals. I peeled the notice off the door, ignoring the faint chew marks on the corner. Maisy again. At least she had good taste. According to the letter, I was now officially in violation of HOA Rule 14.6, LE. No resident shall keep, house, or maintain livestock, poultry, or exotic animals on their property. My goats, livestock, my chickens, poultry, even the rabbits who mostly. It started with a neon orange violation notice slapped right in the middle of my front door. I found it when I came back from my morning deliveries, arms full of fresh eggs and goat cheese. The paper was impossible to miss, practically glowing in the afternoon sun like it was proud of itself. I didn't even have to read it to know who was behind it. Karen Thompson, president of the Willow Creek Estates HOA, self-proclaimed defender of neighborhood property values, and, apparently, the mortal enemy of farm animals. I peeled the notice off the door, ignoring the faint chew marks on the corner. Maisy again. At least she had good taste. According to the letter, I was now officially in violation of HOA Rule 14.6, LE. No resident shall keep, house, or maintain livestock, poultry, or exotic animals on their property. My goats, livestock, my chickens, poultry, even the rabbits who mostly. She gave a little tsk-tsk sound, as if I were a student who'd forgotten his homework. Section 12 of the HOA Charter gives us the right to conduct inspections at any time, for any reason. That's funny, I said, because this property isn't governed by the HOA. She ignored me and waved the woman with the camera forward. The shutter clicks came fast and steady. Chickens, goats, beehives. She even took a photo of my boots sitting by the door, like they might be evidence of a larger crime. Karen stepped closer and handed me the folder. Final notice, she said. Remove all animals by tomorrow, or we'll initiate legal proceedings. I didn't open it. I didn't have to. This was war, and Karen just drew her battle lines on my front lawn. The first sign that Karen had escalated her attack came in the form of Mrs. Callahan, my next-door neighbor, speed-walking past my fence like she was trying to avoid catching a disease. Normally, she'd stop to chat about her grandkids or compliment my tomato plants. But today, not even a glance. Just a stiff grip on her tiny designer dog's leash as she practically dragged it away from my property. By lunchtime, the whispers had started. I spotted a small huddle of HOA regulars by the community park, heads bent together like they were plotting a coup. Karen stood at the center, animated and dramatic, waving her arms around while she spoke. I couldn't hear what she was saying, but I didn't have to. The way one woman gasped and clutched her pearls like I'd personally threatened her made it pretty clear. The rumors spread faster than wildfire. By that afternoon, Mr. Patel, who had always bought my honey at the farmer's market, suddenly avoided eye contact when he got his mail. The Hendersons, who used to let their kids pet my goats, now gave my fence a wide berth. Even the neighborhood Facebook group, normally reserved for complaints about recycling bins and lost cats, was flooded with concerned posts about livestock hygiene and rural encroachment. Karen had gone full fear-mongering. Suddenly, my farm wasn't a peaceful homestead anymore. It was a boosted biohazard. According to Karen's new narrative, my animals were bringing in diseases, ruining the air quality, and somehow attracting crime. Apparently, gangs of poultry-loving criminals were now a major threat to suburban safety. The most ridiculous claim? That my beehives were aggressive and posed a danger to neighborhood children. Never mind that my bees had been here for years, without incident, or that half the HOA board bought honey from me every fall. That didn't stop Karen from spinning some dramatic tale about a neighbor being swarmed and barely making it inside before disaster struck. It was all nonsense, but in a place like Willow Creek Estates, it didn't have to be true. It just had to be, believable enough to make people nervous, and Karen, she was very good at making people nervous. I watched as another neighbor crossed the street to avoid walking past my fence. She was turning them against me, one by one, but if Karen thought I was going to roll over and let her fear tactics work, she was in for a surprise, because I had plans of my own. By the third day, I stopped checking the mailbox with hope. I knew what was waiting for me, stuffed inside like junk mail from a place I never ordered from. Another fine. Another letter printed on official HOA letterhead, complete with Karen's sweeping signature at the bottom, like she was signing an autograph for her biggest fan. At this point, I had enough of them to wallpaper the barn. Maybe Maisy would appreciate the decor. This morning's batch was particularly special. 3 envelopes, each brighter than a traffic cone. The first was a $750 fine for failure to comply with HOA Regulation 14.6b. The second, another $500 for non-removal of prohibited livestock. And the third, well, Karen had outdone herself. It was a cease and desist letter written in thick, aggressive legalese, demanding I remove all animals from my property within 48 hours or face immediate legal action. She was even threatening to bring in animal control, like I was running some backwoods operation instead of the supplier for half the town's organic groceries. I sat on the porch with a mug of coffee, letting the letters sit in my lap while I watched the chickens scratch around by the garden beds. Maisy was chewing on a low branch like it was her life's purpose. The farm was quiet, peaceful, normal, but the pit in my stomach wasn't going anywhere. At noon, a black SUV rolled by, slow enough to be suspicious. I didn't recognize it, but I sure noticed the cell phone pressed against the driver's window, snapping pictures. A minute later, my phone buzzed with an alert from the neighborhood app. Another post from one of Karen's cronies. Concerning violations at 227 Willow Creek Lane. That was me. They'd even posted a blurry photo of my goats as if they were mugshots. The message from Karen that afternoon was short. One sentence. We're giving you one last chance to do the right thing. I stared at the screen, then deleted the message. There was no right thing when it came to Karen, only what served her and what didn't. She thought these fines and threats would scare me into submission. She thought she could push until I caved. But I wasn't going anywhere, and neither were my animals. The quiet knock came just after sunset. Not the usual kind either. No sharp rap of knuckles from someone who wanted to be noticed. This was softer, careful. I wiped my hands on my jeans and opened the door slowly, half expecting another HOA crony with a clipboard, but it wasn't. It was Mr. Rodriguez. He stood there, leaning heavily on his cane, a wool cap pulled low over his ears, even though it was warm out. In his other hand, he held a small paper bag. When I opened the door wider, he gave me a quick nod and shuffled inside without a word. Just like that, my 78-year-old neighbor had officially become the first member of the underground resistance I didn't know I had. "I brought you something," he said, placing the bag on my kitchen table. "Tamales. My granddaughter made too many." I smiled, knowing full well he didn't have a granddaughter, at least not one that lived close by. "Thanks," I said, sitting across from him. He glanced toward the window, like he was worried someone might be watching. "You need to know," he said quietly. "Karen's going after you for a reason." I raised an eyebrow. "Because she hates goats?" He shook his head. "Because she's planning to sell the Greenbelt, all of it. She's working with a developer, wants to put in luxury townhomes." That hit harder than I expected. The Greenbelt was supposed to be protected, open space for the community, land that couldn't be built on. My land bordered it, and if Karen was planning to sell it, she'd need me out of the way first. My farm was the last thing standing between her and a big payout. "She's saying your animals are a health hazard," Mr. Rodriguez said. "If she gets enough complaints, the county steps in. Then she gets what she wants." I stared at him for a long moment, letting it sink in. All the fines, the threats, it wasn't just about my chickens or my bees or Maisy's appetite for trouble. It was about clearing the way for her next big move. He stood up slowly, favoring his bad hip. "Not everyone's against you," he said, heading for the door. "Some of us remember what this place was before Karen." I watched him disappear down the front walk, his cane tapping softly on the gravel. My phone buzzed again, another notice from the HOA. But for the first time in days, I smiled. The quiet resistance had begun. The decision wasn't hard. I'd held off on lawyers as long as I could, but Karen had crossed every line. The cease and desist, the fines, the threats about animal control. I wasn't going to wait around to see what came next. I needed backup. By Tuesday morning, I was sitting across from Cassie Monroe, the sharpest agricultural attorney within 100 miles. Her office smelled like old books and fresh coffee, and she had the kind of expression that told you she'd won cases by sheer willpower alone. She read through the HOA letters, flipping each one over like it offended her personally. "This is garbage," she said finally, tapping one manicured finger against the cease and desist. "They're quoting bylaws that aren't legally enforceable." I raised an eyebrow. "Aren't they allowed to make rules?" "They are," she said, "but there's a process." They skipped half of it. She pushed her glasses higher on her nose and leaned forward. "They needed a 2/3 majority from homeowners to pass the livestock ban. They didn't get it. In fact, from what I can see, they didn't even vote properly." Cassie had already pulled the HOA meeting minutes from the county records office, something I should have done weeks ago but didn't. According to her, the meeting where Karen pushed the livestock ban through was emergency status, called on a day with no public notice. Half the board wasn't even present. "It's procedural quicksand," Cassie said with a smirk. "They're bluffing, but they're hoping you don't know that." I exhaled, the tension in my chest loosening just a little. "So they can't make me get rid of my animals. They can threaten you, they can fine you, but enforcing it, not without a fight." Her smile faded as she leafed through another stack of documents. "That said, they're playing dirty." She showed me a page listing fines racked up by other homeowners, mostly older residents, people Karen probably thought wouldn't fight back. "They're bleeding people dry. You're not the only one." I left her office with a folder full of paperwork and a new sense of purpose. I wasn't just fighting for my farm anymore. This was bigger. Karen had been squeezing the whole neighborhood, and nobody had stood up to her. Well, that was about to change. The first guy showed up on Thursday morning. He was standing on the edge of my property line when I spotted him through the kitchen window, wearing one of those bargain bin security uniforms. Cheap black polo, shiny badge that looked like it came from a party store. He had a clipboard tucked under his arm and was talking into a walkie-talkie like he was on some kind of top-secret mission. At first I figured he was lost, or maybe he was one of Karen's new recruits from the HOA. But then he stepped over the fence line, my fence line, and pulled out his phone to start snapping pictures of my chicken coop. Maisy noticed before I did. She let out a sharp bleat and trotted toward him, head low, already in full-on enforcer mode. For a goat the size of a corgi, she had no business being as intimidating as she was, but I appreciated it. I stepped outside slowly, coffee in hand. "Morning," I said, keeping my voice casual. "Can I help you with something?" He didn't answer, just kept taking pictures. He circled around my vegetable garden like he was casing the place for a heist, even stooping down to take a close-up shot of the beehives. Dumb move. The bees were polite, but they didn't care much for flash photography. When he took another step toward the barn, I'd had enough. "You're trespassing," I said flatly. That got his attention. He straightened up, adjusting his too-tight belt. "I'm with HOA enforcement," he said, like it was supposed to mean something. "I'm here to document ongoing violations." I smiled. "You're standing on private property, and you didn't ask permission." He opened his mouth to argue, but I was already dialing. 3 rings and Sheriff Jensen picked up. He was a decent guy who bought eggs from me every Saturday. I explained the situation, and by the time I was hanging up, the guy was backing toward the fence line like he'd just remembered somewhere else to be. The sheriff arrived 20 minutes later. He took one look at the uniform and shook his head. "Karen's getting bold," he muttered, "but they've been warned." "Warned?" I asked. "For now," he said, giving me a look, "but I'll be keeping an eye on things." I watched the squad car roll away, Maisy still glaring at the fence like she was waiting for round 2. So was I. It wasn't a decision I made lightly. I'd built this business from the ground up, early mornings collecting eggs, late nights bottling honey by hand. My clients were more than customers. They were friends, but sometimes, to make a point, you have to let people feel the absence of something they took for granted. So I stopped the deliveries. No eggs to the Willow Creek organic market. No goat cheese to that fancy cafe Karen loved bragging about on Facebook. No fresh greens to the little bistro that charged $15 for a salad because the lettuce had a name. I didn't make an announcement. I didn't post a rant online or tape a manifesto to anyone's door. I just stopped. By Friday morning, the phone calls started. First was Mary from the farmer's market, wondering if I was running late. Then Joe from the Green Spoon, asking if my truck had broken down. I apologized politely and told them I was taking a step back until some local issues got sorted out. They didn't ask too many questions, yet. By Saturday, it was already happening. The shelves at Willow Creek Market looked bare enough to echo. No cartons of brown speckled eggs in their usual place. No honey jars with the little hand-drawn bee on the label. A sign went up over the empty produce bin. Due to supply issues, items are temporarily unavailable. Karen was standing there when I walked past, staring at the gap where her favorite pasture-raised eggs usually sat. She picked up a carton of factory-farmed stuff with 2 fingers, like it might bite her. I kept walking. By Sunday, prices were climbing. A neighbor told me the diner down on Main Street had stopped offering omelets altogether. Another said they couldn't find goat cheese within a 30-mile radius. People were grumbling. A few started asking questions. I didn't say a word. That afternoon, I found a note tucked under my front gate. No signature, just a sloppy scrawl. "We didn't know. Please come back." I folded it and slipped it into my back pocket. Maisy watched me from her usual spot by the garden, chewing absent-mindedly on an old feed bag. Karen wanted a fight. She was about to find out what happens when you pull the plug on an entire food chain. The HOA's annual brunch was supposed to be Karen's crowning event. She'd been yammering about it for weeks, how this year's spread was going to elevate the neighborhood's profile, and how she'd personally curated every dish to be farm-to-table fabulous. There was a banner at the entrance to the clubhouse that read, "Community, Class, and Cuisine." I figured they should have added catastrophe by the end of the day. I wasn't planning on showing up. I preferred to keep my mornings quiet, but curiosity got the better of me. So I wandered by the clubhouse around 11, just as things were starting to unravel. Karen was standing near a long table covered in white linens, clapping her hands like a kindergarten teacher, trying to get her class to sit still. The table was, well, it was something. A bowl of bruised apples sat awkwardly at one end, next to a sad plate of store-bought croissants. There was a pile of pale, rubbery scrambled eggs that looked like they'd come from a powdered mix, and a bowl of yogurt that was definitely not organic, no matter what the sign claimed. But what really caught my attention was the cheese plate. Or, rather, the lack of one. Just a lonely little wedge of cheddar sweating under plastic wrap. People were noticing. Mrs. Callahan was whispering to her husband, giving the food the same look she'd given my goats the week before. Even Karen's biggest cheerleader, Susan from Lot 12, was poking suspiciously at the eggs like they might fight back. I saw it coming before Karen opened her mouth, but I wasn't ready for how loud she made it. "This," she announced, motioning to the table with a flourish, "is what happens when someone refuses to support community events." Her gaze swept the crowd, pausing on me as if I'd suddenly become the keynote speaker. "We had a supplier back out at the last minute. You all know who." The thing was, most of them didn't. Not really. But now they were looking at me, and not all of them were scowling. I just tipped my hat and kept walking. What Karen didn't understand was simple. She thought cutting me out would be the end of it, but I wasn't just the egg guy. I was the guy who made brunch happen, and without me, she'd just served up her own embarrassment on a silver platter. By Monday morning, my phone was buzzing non-stop. Missed calls, voicemails, texts that ranged from polite inquiries to all-caps panic. The green spoon was out of goat cheese. Willow Creek Market had empty egg cartons stacked like sad little tombstones. Even the fancy bakery on Elm sent a desperate message. No butter, no baguettes. I picked the cafe downtown for the meeting. Neutral ground and the best coffee in a 10-mile radius. I took my usual table on the back patio where Maisy couldn't headbutt the chairs, and waited. One by one, they arrived. There was Joe, head chef at the Green Spoon, Sandy from the bakery, who usually had flour smudged on her nose, Mrs. Patel from the co-op with her ever-present clipboard, even Rick, who ran the upscale grocery where Karen bought her overpriced everything, showed up looking like he hadn't slept in days. They didn't waste time. "What's going on, Tom?" Joe asked, cutting straight to it. "You've never missed a delivery." I laid it out as plainly as I could. Karen, the HOA, the fines, the cease and desist letters, how they'd slapped a livestock ban on me without following legal procedure, how they'd hired knockoff rent-a-cops to harass me, and how it wasn't just about me, it was about clearing the way for Karen's big developer deal. By the time I was done, Sandy's hands were shaking on her coffee cup. Mrs. Patel looked like she wanted to throw her clipboard. Rick was already typing something furiously into his phone. "This is ridiculous," Joe muttered. "You're the backbone of half the businesses in this town." Sandy nodded. "If they shut you down, we're all in trouble." Rick sighed and leaned back. "Karen thinks she's important because she throws brunches. She doesn't realize who's actually keeping this place running." They pledged their support before I even asked for it. They were pulling their personal business from anyone tied to Karen and the HOA. Rick promised to spread the word to the other grocers. Sandy offered to contact the food writers she knew, and Joe said he'd handle the chefs. "We've got your back," he said. She picked the wrong supplier to mess with. I sat there for a moment after they left, feeling the weight shift. Karen thought she was fighting one stubborn farmer. What she didn't realize was I wasn't standing alone anymore. I figured it was only a matter of time before the story got out. What I didn't figure was how fast it would spread once it did. One minute, I was unloading crates of carrots for the co-op, and the next, there was a news van idling at the end of my driveway. Channel 7, the local station. Not exactly national coverage, but around here, it was like the New York Times had shown up. The reporter was young, maybe mid-20s, with a nervous smile and a microphone she gripped like it might bite. She introduced herself as Casey and asked if I had time to talk. I glanced at Maisy, who was chewing her cud and giving Casey a look like she might ask for union rates. I shrugged. Why not? We sat at the picnic table under the oak tree while her cameraman got set up. Casey kept looking at the goats, the chickens, and the hives, like she expected something out of a horror movie, but all she saw was a quiet farm, exactly what it had always been. She started with soft questions. How long had I lived here? How long had I run the farm? Then she got to the real story. The HOA, Karen, the sudden fines, the threats, the livestock ban that had never been properly passed. I told her everything, straight and simple. No drama, no finger-pointing, just facts. How Karen was pushing to sell the Greenbelt. How she needed me out of the way to make it happen. And how, in doing so, she'd managed to cut off half the town's food supply. When the piece aired that night, it was clear who came out looking like the villain. They ran footage of Karen from last year's HOA meeting, where she'd gone on about preserving the integrity of the neighborhood. They showed clips of my farm, Maisy headbutting the fence post for good measure, and neighbors talking about how the HOA had fined them for things like non-uniform lawn gnomes. By morning, Karen's reputation was unraveling faster than cheap yarn. People were asking questions. They were digging. And what they were finding wasn't pretty. The tide was turning. And Karen? She was about to learn how fast a house of cards can blow over when you forget who's holding the deck. The emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for 7 o'clock sharp, but by 6:30, the clubhouse parking lot was already jammed. People were spilling onto the sidewalk, some holding folding chairs, others gripping manila envelopes like they were gearing up for war. There was a low hum of voices, the kind that usually happened right before a storm. I parked along the edge of the greenbelt and watched for a moment before grabbing my folder and heading in. Inside, Karen was already at the front, standing behind a podium that looked more like a shield than a piece of furniture. She'd worn her usual power outfit, a bright red blazer and heels that clacked loudly on the hardwood. Her smile was stretched tight, like it had been stapled on. Sitting beside her were the remaining HOA board members, except I noticed one or two conspicuously empty chairs. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," she began, voice high and cheery, like she was hosting a bake sale instead of a crisis meeting. "I know there's been confusion lately." Confusion. Sure. I took a seat in the back with Cassie, my attorney, who looked like she was ready to eat someone alive. She set her briefcase on the chair next to her and flipped it open with the kind of precision that made board members nervous. Karen launched into a speech about protecting property values and maintaining community standards. It was all going fine for her until she opened the floor for questions. That's when it fell apart. Mrs. Callahan stood up first, waving a copy of her latest violation notice. $300 because my roses are too fragrant? Are you serious? Then it was Mr. Patel, shouting about a fine for unapproved wind chimes. One by one, neighbors stood up, and it was less a discussion and more a mutiny. 2 board members announced their resignation before Karen could even shuffle her papers. One of them mumbled something about not signing up for this mess on his way out the door. Cassie gave me the nod. I stood up and walked to the front, dropping a thick stack of documents on the podium. "For the record," I said calmly, "these show the livestock bylaw wasn't legally passed, and the fines issued under it are unenforceable." Karen's face turned the color of bad ham. Cassie leaned forward, smiling like a wolf. "We'll be filing formal complaints first thing tomorrow." And just like that, Karen's iron grip slipped right off the wheel. By 9 o'clock the next morning, Cassie had already filed 2 separate complaints, one with the State Agricultural Commission, the other with the county's housing authority. She sipped her coffee like it was just another Tuesday while I sat across from her kitchen table, watching her type up things that sounded far more serious than I'd even imagined. "Fraud, intimidation, procedural violations," she said, tapping each point on her checklist like she was picking items off a menu. "Karen's made this easy." I didn't know much about legal paperwork, but I knew enough to recognize the word investigation when it came up again and again. And sure enough, 2 days later, a pair of sedans from the county's compliance office rolled up to the HOA clubhouse. The inspectors weren't subtle. Clipboard guys never are. They were knocking on doors within the hour, and neighbors were lining up to tell their stories. It spread fast. Word that Karen was under investigation hit the group chat by lunchtime. Mrs. Patel posted a picture of one of the county officers walking into Karen's front yard. The caption was simple: "Popcorn? Anyone?" But it wasn't just the livestock ban they were looking at. Turns out, Karen had been doing a lot more under the radar. When the county audit team got hold of the HOA's financials, they found numbers that didn't add up. Dues that had mysteriously increased but never quite made it into the maintenance fund. A chunk of money labeled as beautification that seemed to have gone straight into private contractors, one of whom, surprise, surprise, was Karen's cousin. The icing on the cake, the greenbelt sale she'd been pushing. Turns out, there hadn't been a community vote. She'd forged proxy forms, fake signatures from homeowners who didn't even know the vote had happened. One of them was Mr. Rodriguez. He waved his cane at the inspector and swore he never signed anything in his life that wasn't a birthday card. The State Agricultural Commission was quieter about their work, but I got the sense they weren't here for a social visit either. An inspector spent a long time walking my property, checking my paperwork, and confirming that everything was above board. At the end, he gave me a firm nod. "You're clean," he said, "but your HOA's in for a rough ride." Good. It was about time. Karen didn't go quietly. That wasn't her style. By the time the county wrapped up their initial findings, she was in full damage control mode. She started plastering the neighborhood bulletin boards with cheerful flyers about new HOA leadership initiatives, promising pizza nights and community yoga. She even held a pop-up lemonade stand in front of the clubhouse with free cookies. Like we were all going to forget she'd spent the last 6 months shaking people down over mailbox colors and lawn heights. I wasn't buying it, and neither was anyone else. The real kicker came on a Thursday afternoon when Cassie and I were sitting on my porch sipping sweet tea. The process server pulled up in a dusty sedan that had definitely seen better days. He got out, straightened his tie, and headed straight for Karen's house with a manila envelope tucked under his arm. We didn't have to wait long. Karen's shriek could probably be heard 3 blocks over. "Is that?" I asked. Cassie nodded, setting her tea down with a grin. "That's the first of 3. Fraud, harassment, and misuse of HOA funds." By Friday morning, Karen's biggest ally on the board, Linda from Lot 9, had resigned. No speech, no warning, just a "for sale" sign planted in her yard before breakfast. 2 other board members followed. They didn't even stick around for the emergency meeting Karen called that night. From what I heard, it was just her, sitting at the front of the clubhouse, staring down an empty row of chairs. The HOA email list lit up like a bonfire. Residents were demanding refunds, calling for a full dissolution vote. Some were talking about filing their own lawsuits. A few mentioned criminal charges. Karen tried one last time to save face. She sent out a long-winded email titled "A Message from Your Dedicated HOA President," full of buzzwords about unity and shared vision. She signed it with a smiley face. Nobody responded. By Sunday, the clubhouse was locked up. The HOA office was empty, files boxed up and gone. Karen's car, once proudly parked front and center with its vanity plates, KWEENHOA, was nowhere to be seen. And just like that, the empire Karen built on petty fines and power plays crumbled. All that remained was the mess she left behind, and we were more than ready to clean it up. The first morning after the dust settled felt quieter than it had in months. Not the tense kind of quiet, where you're waiting for another fine or a knock on the door, but the easy kind. Peaceful. The chickens seemed to notice it too. They strutted around like they owned the place, which, let's be honest, they probably thought they did. Maisy was back to her usual antics, head-butting the same fence post she'd been working on since spring. She'd almost won too. I was mucking out the goat stall when I heard footsteps on the gravel path. For a split second I tensed up, half expecting another HOA goon with a clipboard. But when I looked up, it was Mrs. Callahan, holding an empty egg carton in both hands like an offering. "I was wondering," she said, clearing her throat, "if you had any eggs to spare. The ones from the store just don't taste right." I smiled and nodded toward the hen house. "Help yourself. Just watch out for Hilda. She's broody." Word spread fast after that. By the end of the week, half the neighborhood had stopped by the farm at least once. Some came for eggs. Others picked up jars of honey or baskets of tomatoes. A few just wanted to see the goats up close, laughing when Maisy gave their shins a nudge. Mr. Rodriguez even brought his great-grandson over to help collect eggs, the kid grinning ear to ear like he'd struck gold. Neighbors who hadn't spoken to me in months now lingered at the fence, asking questions about crop rotation and how to start their own garden plots. I offered advice, even helped Mrs. Patel set up a raised bed behind her house. Sandy from the bakery brought over a basket of scones as thanks for the honey. They were terrible, but I ate 3 anyway. For the first time in a long time, the farm didn't feel like a battlefield. It felt like home again. And not just mine. I stood by the fence that evening, watching Maisy chew a dandelion like it was a delicacy. Beyond her, the garden beds were green and full, and the beehives hummed softly in the golden light. Karen's war was over. We'd won. And life on the farm was better than ever. Karen's house went on the market 2 weeks after the lawsuits landed. One day her car was in the driveway, her rose bushes trimmed within an inch of their lives. The next, the place was stripped bare. The wreath on the door was gone. The little welcome friends mat that no one had ever actually stepped on disappeared overnight. By morning, there was a shiny new for sale sign, staked into her perfect lawn, the kind with a QR code and motivated seller in bright red letters. Neighbors started swapping stories the minute the sign went up. Some said Karen had left town entirely. Others claimed she was holed up at her sister's place 3 counties over, dodging subpoenas. My favorite rumor was that she'd tried to join another HOA over in Maple Heights and was politely told she wasn't a good fit. Apparently, word travels fast when you're a power-hungry tyrant who gets caught with both hands in the cookie jar. There was talk of her facing criminal charges, but that was up to the county and the state attorney. Either way, nobody was lining up to defend her. Even Linda from Lot 9, her biggest cheerleader, had stopped mentioning Karen's name altogether. Last I heard, Linda was trying to offload her own house before anyone else could bring up her time on the board. Meanwhile, things in Willow Creek Estates started to change. Small things at first. The ridiculous fines stopped, obviously, but so did the nonsense rules. People painted their doors colors that made them happy instead of sticking to approved earth tones. The Hendersons put up a bright blue mailbox with little yellow flowers painted on the side. Nobody complained. The community potluck came back, and this time it wasn't some thin excuse for Karen to hand out violation notices. People brought their own dishes, pulled up lawn chairs, and didn't worry if their grass was half an inch too long. The conversations felt lighter, easier. We were all breathing again. I saw the moving van haul away Karen's furniture on a Thursday. Maisy watched from the fence line, chewing on her favorite stick. When the van pulled away, leaving nothing but tire tracks in its place, I couldn't help but smile. It was over. Karen was gone, and the neighborhood was finally ours again. By spring, things were different. Not just because Karen was gone, though no one missed the sight of her pastel pantsuits pacing up and down the sidewalks, but because the neighborhood had finally started to feel like a community again. The kind where people waved instead of peeking through blinds. The kind where you borrowed a cup of sugar without worrying about whether your hedges met some arbitrary height requirement. The new HOA board was elected by unanimous vote, and this time, it wasn't a group of clipboard warriors. It was neighbors who actually gave a damn. People like Mr. Rodriguez, who chaired the new Green Spaces Committee from the comfort of his front porch, and Sandy from the bakery, who organized monthly potlucks that didn't involve passive-aggressive speeches about lawn maintenance. They even rewrote the HOA charter, trimming out the nonsense about mailbox colors and planting height limits. The new motto: common sense and community first. Cassie said it was still the best legal work she'd ever overseen. As for me, the farm grew, not just in size, though we added 2 more garden plots and another beehive, but in spirit. People stop by more often now, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. Mrs. Callahan came every Tuesday for eggs and stayed to help harvest tomatoes. The Henderson kids helped build a little stand by the driveway where they sold honey and fresh produce for pocket change. Maisy supervised, of course. She had taken to lying right by the stand, chewing her cud like some kind of security guard who worked for belly scratches. We even started a weekend farmers market in the old HOA clubhouse lot. What used to be ground zero for Karen's endless meetings was now a place for homemade jams, homegrown vegetables, and hand-knitted scarves. Nobody asked for permission to set up a booth. They just did it. Sometimes people would come by and thank me for standing up, for sticking it out, for reminding them that a neighborhood wasn't supposed to feel like a gated prison with perfect lawns. I always told them the same thing. It wasn't about me. It was about all of us. And as the sun set behind Willow Creek Estates, with the fields full of green and the soft cluck of chickens settling in for the night, I figured we'd done something right. A farm might grow food, but a community, that's where you grow roots.